religious freedom, and the media. The International Media Association for Peace strives to be an open forum in which journalists and scholars can discuss freely and promote the defense of human dignity by promoting universal values, leading to mutual prosperity and peaceful coexistence in our global community of nations. And our theme today will be the weight of words. What is the media's role in preserving religious freedom? Those who pursue a career in journalism often do so because they believe their work contributes to the betterment of society. The same could be said of those who join spiritual religious communities as well. However, research shows that media representation of religious communities is often negative, or even worse, derisive. What are the implications of religious representation in the media, both culturally and politically, and why does it matter for religious freedom? So some of the topics we'll be exploring today are how religious issues are dealt with in the media, what can be done to educate members of the media on issues of religious freedom, and thirdly, how to overcome anti-religious bias in the media. And joining us as panelists in this month's IMAP webinar is Professor Joel Campbell from the Brigham Young University School of Communications, Mr. Bobby Ross, Junior Editor for the Christian Chronicle, and Ms. Nancy Jubb, Media Spokesperson for the Family Federation for World Peace and Communication. Our moderator today is Mr. Hans Moyer. Hans' family escaped from communist regime in East Germany in 1960. His family emigrated from West Germany to the US in 1963, and Hans has often commented that his remembrance of America of his youth is a place where neighbors treated each other, extended family, with love and kindness. Hans has been active in the unification movement for over 40 years now, and he currently serves as the executive director for the Universal Peace Federation in Pennsylvania and is coordinator for International Media Association for Peace here in the United States of America. He's the parent of 3 adult children and the grandparent of 1 granddaughter. Welcome, Hans.
You're muted.
Thank you, Ray, and welcome everyone. We have a wonderful program prepared for you today, and I'm going to introduce our first presenter. Professor Joel Campbell is Associate Professor at Brigham Young University School of Communications since 2002. He holds a master's degree from Ohio State University. He teaches communications studies and journalism courses. He actively researches media and religion, media ethics, and law and freedom of information issues. His publications include Mitt Romney's Religion, a 5-factor model for analysis of media representation of Mormon identity. Also, Artemis Ward, The Forgotten Influence of the Genial Showman's Mormon Lecture on Public Opinion of Mormons in the United States and Great Britain. And the third publication, Baptism of Fire, a comparative analysis of media coverage of the Latter-day Saints Church practice of proxy baptism. His title today for his presentation is Moving from Distrust to Cooperative Engagement. Professor Campbell, the class is ready for you.
Okay, let me share my screen. Let's see here. Can you see
it's loading, yeah.
Okay. Let me just try it one more time. For some reason, it wasn't sharing it quite the way I wanted to. All right. So as I've talked about this idea of engagement, I'm kind of subtitling it also as resetting the relationship. As I thought about what's going on in the world with media and with religion, and I wanted to maybe think maybe there's a chance here to talk about resetting. By the way, you're welcome to access these slides at that bit.ly link, Reset Journal Faith there. So I had a group of students. We were studying media and religion in New York City a few years ago, and I loved this thing that was on the street in New York City spiritual help 5 cents. So I'm going to say that we all need some help, journalists, spokespeople, and the public. And perhaps we're not quite in the mode of having journalists all agree that the idea of religious freedom may be foreign to some or misunderstood. So that's what I want to direction. So here are some of the issues that I think that define what's dividing us. Obviously, understanding different worldviews, replacing contempt with dignity, understand that good journalism is not devotional, confessional, promotional coverage. That often comes from the church side. I certainly work at a religious university, and some of my colleagues say, well, that journalist didn't, promote the faith. And I keep reminding them, well, it's not the journalist's job to necessarily promote my faith, but to cover it accurately. And journalists may come from a background of religious illiteracy or lack of respect for a frame that respects religious belief as a valid point of view. And I'm going to introduce some deadly sins of religion reporting that I think illustrate that in a few minutes. So first of all, I wanted to introduce this survey that came out in October of 2022 that said media coverage of religion is broken. It was a very exhaustive national global survey and had some very fascinating elements about what is going on with religion and the media. I think most telling, and there's some links on here if you want to read the whole survey. It's very lengthy and very full of information, but here's some takeaways. There is a growing gap between the coverage of religion and the needs of the faithful. There is a global desire for better coverage, understanding, and representation of faith in the media. So respondents in this survey, said that there is, we would want more accurate information about religion and belief. 53% of respondents say the media actively ignores religion as an aspect of society and culture. And then 59% of respondents believe that it's important that the news media cover a diverse set of faith and religious perspectives. And 63% say that high quality content on faith and religion is needed in their respective countries. I just found that fascinating because as Bobby Ross will know, in the age of when there's so much cutting going on in a newsroom and so much downsizing, there still is a need for people to want to read and understand religion issues. And one of the quotes that came out of this study says, many news desks shun real religious news because they believe the subject matter is too tricky to get across properly, and the fear of getting anything wrong is too great. But ignoring these stories or not reporting them fully is anti-journalism. So I often say that the First Amendment has both freedom of religion and freedom of press in it. There is a connection. We're kind of on either side of the coin. And so I think there is some connection here about the ability to report about journalism, about faith. So here's just I often do some media training for diverse groups of people. Here's just some ideas that might come across for those of you who are spokespeople in whatever environment you're in. So the cooperation between journalists and media should be based on trust and mutual respect. Hopefully that's being cultivated before the crisis. And it certainly is going to be compromised by discourteous or unethical behavior on either side. But at the same time, journalists and spokespeople often fight the same battle. So we do have common ground. To tell a client's or organization story. So what's the role of a PR spokesperson? By the way, anyone on social media these days becomes it can be a spokesperson for a particular faith. And it might be picked up by the media. But so it's very important to understand that anybody now has the ability to be a spokesperson. So I think it's critical, and this is very basic journalism 101. What's the job of a journalist, and how should religious folks understand that? It is the job to be independent, to seek truth and report it, minimize harm, be independent, be accountable, be a watchdog or check and balance. And unlike I tell my students in class, if you want to be a journalist, you stand up and say, I'm going to be independent. And if you're thinking about deciding between public relations and journalism, I go stand in front of the mirror and say, 10 times, I am an advocate. I am an advocate. If you feel good about that, that's great. Then you should go be in PR. So that's kind of the different roles we have. So what are some of the issues I see as working with religion and journalists is that sometimes people cue that the idea that journalist's job may not be to defend or promote, and that we shouldn't expect that journalists will engage in what we call confessional or devotional journalism. They are going to pursue critics and critical points of view, and often your public relations is not going to change that. But the best a religious organization can hope for is that journalists provide balance and fairness in the reporting. And that's what I think you're talking about today, that you have seen with different reporting from, in particular, I think we talked about Japan in the last episode of this, some of the unfairness and inability to balance what's going on. So I'm going to go through these sins of deadly sins, and you may know that I'm going to, if you want to look at these because of time, I'm going to just slip over this really quickly. I want to go to so my meat of what I wanted to say is what are some long view solutions to work with religion and journalists? Draw on the work of professional groups trying to build ethics and religious literacy among journalists. That recent survey, I think, gives us plenty of fodder to say, hey, journalists, hey, news organizations, there's a need for religion reporting. Help to understand the needs of journalists to better report about religion. How can we help journalists? That's what I'm kind of about as a professor. Find journalists who have training in religion coverage, like a Bobby Ross, and help them with that. And help to build a reporting frame based on respect and even a appreciation for religious freedom. Unfortunately, there are some journalists who may think that religion is an invalid point of view and shouldn't be considered a valid point of view in a news story or a reporting. Increase media and journalism religion courses at universities. That's what I'm doing. There's a picture of my students in front of St. John the Divine in New York. Empower interfaith groups to encourage better religion coverage locally. Reporter training at professional conferences and organizations. Join with like-minded religious groups who want fair reporting no matter the faith. Tack academic groups interested in religion and media, religion reporting organizations, and the list goes on. I just want to show you a montage here of things that you might think about. The next slide has links to many of these. For example, here at Brigham University, we have a Religious Freedom Annual Review. Bobby Ross, who's on our panel, participated in a media track at one of those annual reviews talking about religious freedom and how we could improve reporting on religious freedom. The Religion News Association, the International Association of Religion Journalists. I'm involved with the Religion and Media Interest Group of the Association of Journalism Mass Communication. There's a Lilly Endowment for Global Religion Initiative. And I'm happy to report that in March of this year, 22nd to 24th, we're hosting about 25 Latin American journalists. We're flying in to talk about religious freedom and improving their religious reporting in Latin America. Here's some of the links and some of the things that are here. There's a lot of things we can do, I believe, to link into these. And I just leave these links here, and you certainly can access my slides to see those. Joe Grimm at Michigan State has a great project he does every semester with his students, where he creates a bias buster guides to Muslims, to Latter-day Saints, to evangelicals, to all sorts of religious groups. Those are just a wonderful project that a journalism professor is doing. Also, a government example, I have a former student of mine who's involved with the all-party parliamentary group in the UK. And they have created this dialogue with in the parliament in the UK. And one of the things that I felt was really important there is there's an emphasis on education for journalists to improve their coverage. So here's a government, the UK government, getting involved in promoting this. Here's some other kinds of things. Bobby Ross, maybe you could talk more about any of these. Wonderful sites that kind of give criticism of media coverage of religion and faith. You might consider religion and media workshops or seminars or like we're doing here at BYU with Latin American journalists. I'd just like to end with this thought. The Latter-day Saints were building a new temple in Stockholm, Sweden, several decades ago, and there was a lot of anti-Mormonism going on at that time. Christopher Steindar used to be a professor at Harvard Divinity School. He held a press conference and as the Bishop of Stockholm. And Christopher Steindal came out in front of the cathedral there in Stockholm and said, why are you, what's about the Mormons? What's going on with them? And he said, I have 3 rules of religious understanding. First is, when trying to understand another religion, you should always ask the adherents of that religion and not its enemies. Don't compare your best to their worst and leave room for holy envy. Now, I think for journalists, we should expect the first 2. We may not get holy envy, but I certainly do have a holy envy for many faiths. And that's what I teach my students when we go to visit many faiths, is to have that holy envy. So I realize I was kind of rushed through that a little bit, but I hope that that sets a tone about where we can maybe have a dialogue about improving journalism. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Campbell. That was well done and gave us a clear view of the territory that we need to cover. And what I realized is that quality media really is a team effort, and so we have representatives of the entire team with us today, and I'll introduce our next presenter. Mr. Bobby Ross Jr. is the editor-in-chief. I really apologize for the typos in all of our communications, but he is the editor-in-chief of the Christian Chronicle and a former religion writer for the Associated Press and the Oklahoman, right? Right. He writes a weekly newsletter on the best reads and top headlines in the world of faith for religionunplugged.com. In his 3-decade career, he has reported from all 50 states and 15 countries and won numerous national awards. His family includes his wife, Tammy, 2 sons, a daughter, 2 daughters-in-law, 2 perfect grandchildren, and an adorable bunny. He lives in Oklahoma City. So let's hear it for grandparents. Hoorah.
Yes, sir.
The floor is yours, Bobby, go.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation to come and talk. And Joel Campbell, this is not going to be anywhere near as great or as detailed as him. He's a professional journalism professor and did a great job. I'll just, I guess, mainly talk from the perspective of someone who's been a journalist for a long time and covered religion for a long time, just kind of my personal perspective that maybe will give some insight into where journalists in general are coming from. I guess my first topic was how religious issues are dealt with in the media. And I thought I would start with just kind of discussing how I got into the whole realm of religion writing, because I grew up in the Churches of Christ. It's an a cappella fellowship of probably conservative Christians. Most members in the South, Tennessee, Texas, or where we're the strongest, and had got into journalism to cover like police and politics and general news. I never had any idea that I would cover religion. And then about 1999, I was working at the Oklahoman, which is the newspaper here in Oklahoma City, and had been there several years. And they came to me and said, hey, Pope John Paul II is coming to St. Louis in January of 99, and we'd like you to go cover that. And looking back on that, nearly a quarter century later, it's like, that was a great story, and I should have been real excited about that. But I think at the time I was like, I'm Church of Christ. I'm not a Catholic. What are people at my church going to think? I don't know a lot about Catholics. How am I going to do that? So I'll rush through the story a little bit, but it was, basically a little bit of leeriness about getting into the realm of religion coverage, because to me, journalism was politics and crime and things blowing up and that kind of thing. And religion was a different animal. And I didn't know how to go about covering religion and maintaining my own faith. And so I called one of my ministers and said, hey, they want me to go cover the Pope. Should I tell them no? Or what do you think about this? He said, are you nuts? That's a great story. That's what you do. You go write about things and you try to be fair. You try to be accurate. You try to be honest. And, nobody's ever accused you of agreeing with the city council or the state legislature just because you wrote a story about what they did or about what they believed. So long story short, I went and covered the Pope. There were tens and tens of thousands of people who had made a pilgrimage there from across the U.S. I learned a lot about Catholics. I wrote several front page stories. And one thing I learned in that experience was I felt like my faith, kind of the fact that I was coming from a faith background, kind of allowed me to understand where other people of faith were coming from, just because, we were coming from a common measure of faith being important in our lives, even if we didn't share the specific beliefs or the specific faith. So that was an eye-opening experience for me. And at this point, I always stop and say, I'm not saying you can't be an atheist and cover religion, because there's a lot of, there's some atheists that I know that are some really great religion reporters. So in my case, it's helpful that I'm a person of faith, but I'm not saying it's essential that you have to be a person of faith. I'll just quickly mention, I still freelance for the Associated Press. So I've done some stories in the last few months about the synagogue in Colleyville, Texas, where 4 people were held hostage about a year ago, and really had a great experience just talking to the rabbi and the men who were held hostage there at that church. And as a religion reporter, I basically, on some of what we discussed, I just acknowledged pretty openly, my background is Christian. You're going to have to explain some of this to me. I'm open-minded and I want to understand, but there are things that you're going to have to explain to me. And the other thing I recently did for AP was the dedication of a $50 million shrine here in Oklahoma City for the Catholic Church, where, even 25 years of covering Catholics off and on in various ways, there are still questions that I have to ask and familiarize myself with. But in general, it's just the way I've approached it is trying to be respectful toward people of faith. When you're doing a story, the advice, I go talk to an ethics class here in Oklahoma at a state university every semester. And basically I say, my go as a reporter, and what I think a fair journalist should do, is that when people read how they are reflected in a story, you should not only quote them accurately, but quote them in a way such that when they read the story, they recognize themselves in it. Because there's a way to quote people verbatim what they said and totally get wrong what they said. So I think that's crucial. I'll move on. I've got stuck on that first section. What can be done to educate members of the media on issues of religious freedom? I have just a few random ideas. I think in general, journalists are big fans of the First Amendment. We definitely like to promote the freedom of the press. So sometimes it might be helpful to remind them that the press isn't the only freedom that's covered there, that it also covers speech, assembly, freedom to petition the government, and yes, freedom of religion. Educating members of the media on religious freedom. I think that in the age we live in the US, that can be complicated because everybody's definition of religious freedom seems to be slightly different. And even terms like religious liberty have taken on political connotations, such that Terry Mattingly at Get Religion refers to it as scare quotes when journalists will kind of put quote marks around religious liberty as if it's not a thing that really exists. But so I guess what I'm saying is religious freedom is the freedom to practice your own faith, and it's the freedom to be free of forced religion. in the public sphere. And as we've seen in the Supreme Court in the recent years, there's a lot more clashes there. So your definition of religious freedom and my definition of religious freedom may not always be the same. I've asked a few fellow religion writers about this question about what could someone do to educate members of the media on religious freedom. And at this point, I will point out that I'm a member of the Religion News Association, and the religion writers I'm most often dealing with are people who are doing this full time and are really committed to understanding religion and knowing about religion. So probably I'm getting somewhat of a skewed view of what a general person might be getting from the local city council reporter who suddenly there's a religion story and they're suddenly put on it and without a lot of expertise. But this one journalist said, as religious freedom has become an increasingly contentious topic, it's become more reasonable for reporters to avoid the phrase altogether. So if a faith group wants coverage of a specific plight, they should speak about the specific plight rather than using a broad description like our religious freedom is threatened. Another religion journalist who's one of the best and fairest reporters I know said, one thing I've learned is that most media outlets, news organizations, don't care about, say, what's happening with Iran, but they do care about the Iranian community in their backyard. So she'd advise the people listening to this webinar to find a local tie-in if they can regarding religious freedom. She also points out that so many religious groups do not deal well with the media. For instance, they don't answer phone calls or emails for several days. She says, tell them that is a no-no, answer within the hour. One group that's really up their sophistication is the Jehovah's Witnesses. They are so much easier to talk with them before. That's true. I mean, I used to never hear from the Jehovah's Witnesses, and now they will even send direct messages on Twitter. How to overcome anti-religious bias in the media. Joe, I liked your 3 rules of religious understanding. I think those are very helpful. I guess as far as anti-religious bias, I think there is some anti-religious bias, but I think there's also just some disconnect between ordinary people, religious people, and the news media. I'll tell a story about I think that in the midst of COVID, I got into a conversation with a woman who was talking about the media being the enemy of the people, and she didn't trust the media, and the media is just out there to get you. And I said, well, Mom, you realize your son, your daughter, your son-in-law, that we're all journalists, and so you're talking about us. And she's like, no, not you, those other media people. So I think so. But anyway, the best, as far as anti-religious bias, Joe had great ideas. I think my advice would be just deal with people on a personal level, especially if you have the opportunity to connect with journalists on a one-on-one basis, get to know them kind of hopefully outside the arena of a crisis or a scandal, get to know them. And, Joel and I, Joel's Mormon, I'm Church of Christ. We both have some restoration roots, but we have a lot of different theology. But we spent time together there at Brigham Young, where they do have caffeinated Diet Coke, and I think that was a good experience for us. But I think just I've heard one prominent journalist used to always say every religion's really strange to those on the outside, and that's probably true. So it probably helps to get together with people and kind of just build some bridges. Sometimes anti-religion bias isn't bias so much as somebody did something really bad. A church or a religious group allowed sex abuse to children or something, and there's no way to spin a story like that positively. And I guess my bottom line, and as far as anti-religious bias and dealing with the media, because I'm dragging on too long, is be responsive, like the reporter I quoted said. I mean, I don't think ignoring the media is going to help. I say be honest. My mother always taught me that if you're always honest, you never have to remember what you said to the previous person. I do think be strategic. You can, when there's Google, you can figure out what somebody's reported in the past and how they reported it. And especially if it's a national story or a crisis story that's getting a lot of attention, you can find the person you feel like is going to be the fairest to you, because there are people that do have track records of being more advocates even in journalism than they are journalists trying to be impartial. I'd say be helpful, but be careful. Usually the interviews I do now, I record all of them. I would say if you're giving an interview to somebody, they're probably recording it. You should have a recording too. If you're emailing somebody in the media, you should expect that anything you say in an email is on the record. And I think I've taken my time, so I'll stop talking now, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Bobby. That was wonderful. You took us from the ivory towers right onto the street, the life of a reporter. And I kept hearing you say the importance of honesty, and I was listening recently to a talk that former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave at a religious freedom rally. And he said, whenever I dialogue with any of the world leaders, the first thing I told them is, I'm a Christian. And I want you to understand that. And that's how I see the world, and that's where I'm coming from. So I think, that point that you made is really, really important. So thank you for that presentation. It was really wonderful. Okay, our next guest, and we have our next guest to thank for the title of our program today. So Miss Nancy Jubb is the Communications Director for the Family Federation for World Peace and Unification, USA. Prior to this, she worked for the U.S. Department of State at the the American Embassy in London, where she was awarded for her pioneering work in social media communication. She holds a bachelor's degree in journalism and media from the University of London, Birkbeck College, and is currently dabbling in a master's in divinity, wow, at the Unification Theological Seminary. She also serves on the board of directors for two national nonprofit organizations, the Religion Communicators Council and the Women's Federation for World Peace, USA. She is also a proud wife of 18 years and the mother of 4 dynamic daughters. Miss Jubb, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that that wonderful introduction. I'm so honored to be part of this webinar. I feel like I've already gained a lot just by listening to Mr. Ross and Professor Campbell. So many great points, and so many great points that I also experienced as well, doing this role of communications director for Family Federation for World Peace and Unification USA over the last, 7 years now. So I would like to share my presentation with you all. So my presentation today is called The Pen, Sword or Shield, Ethical Considerations in Language Used by Media Professionals from the Lens of Cognitive Behavior. I think that, sorry, let me just pull up my notes. It was really interesting to hear Mr. Ross talk about what the day-to-day realities of journalists on the ground is like. And I think that in today's society, where we're so polarized across so many different lines of identity, that it's really easy to kind of look, especially from a religious organization's perspective, it's really easy to kind of vilify the media. Oh, the media is out to get us. They're evil. But the truth is that most people get into journalism because there is this call to a noble profession. A lot of journalists they really respect and identify with this idea of the press being the fourth estate, a body that can hold power to account and be a voice for the voiceless. And so rather than looking at them as like an enemy, I think it's really important for us to actually figure out how can we work together based on our shared connection of humanity? And I think the cognitive sciences are a great way to look at how we might overcome our differences and come together a little bit better. So anybody who knows me knows that I am a huge, huge Brene Brown fan. I love everything and anything that she does, but I think it really speaks to why language is so important. In her latest book, Atlas of the Heart, she talks about language matters. It's the raw material of story. It changes how we feel about ourselves and others, and it's a portal to connection. With the same amount of power, language can also be used to strip people of their dignity and humanity. And with awareness about how dehumanization works comes the responsibility to call out dangerous language when we see it. I think this is powerful on many different levels, not just looking at the media, but also it really applies to our personal lives as well. But I won't jump into that too much. So in her latest book, actually, she talks a lot about the language around the emotion and the science around the emotion of contempt, disgust, and dehumanization. I'd like to read an excerpt just to kind of highlight why it's so relevant to media coverage. Dehumanization is a process. I think Michelle Mays, a professor in the philosophy department at Emmanuel College, lays it out in a way that makes sense. So I'll use some of her work here to walk us through it. Mays defines dehumanization as the psychological process of demonizing the enemy, making them seem less than human and hence not worthy of humane treatment. Dehumanization often starts with creating an enemy image. As we take sides, lose trust, and get angrier and angrier, we not only solidify an idea of our enemy, but we also start to lose our ability to listen, communicate, and practice even a modicum of empathy. Once we see people on the other side of a conflict as morally inferior and even dangerous, the conflict starts being framed as good versus evil. Mays writes, once the parties have framed the conflict in this way, their positions become more rigid. In some cases, zero-sum thinking develops as parties come to believe that they must either secure their own victory or face defeat. New goals to punish or destroy the opponent arise, and in some cases, more militant leadership comes into power. And another short excerpt. Successful dehumanizing, however, creates moral exclusion. Groups targeted based on their identity, gender, ideology, skin color, ethnicity, religion, age are depicted as less than or criminal or even evil. The targeted group eventually falls out of the scope of who is naturally protected by our moral code. This is moral exclusion and dehumanization at its core. So, the word that I have up here on the slide, I think a lot of people have a very people from minority religious groups may have a very visceral reaction to this word, who feel that they've been misrepresented. And other people might look at this word and think, so what? We say the cult of Lululemon or the cult of Apple, but actually the word itself bears such weight. When we take into consideration the title of this whole webinar, the weight of words, actually, the word cult was created with the intent of othering, of separating groups and kind of deeming them outside of society. And with this word, even in the most innocuous context of like the cult of Apple or the cult of Lululemon, even that denotes this kind of moral superiority that, well, I'm not stupid enough to follow them, or, and that's dangerous because that is where contempt starts to breed. And from contempt, it's a slippery slope right into dehumanization. We study history, we look at the Holocaust, we look at genocide, we look at all of these atrocities that humanity can perpetuate, and we wonder, how do we get there, right? Well, it starts from it starts from emotions of contempt, of disgust, of moral superiority. And that's why it's so important for us each, even personally, to really examine ourselves and to ask ourselves where I might have these feelings of bias towards other people. Contempt is such a powerful emotion that even the Gottman Institute, which study marriages, they can predict with over 90% accuracy who will get a divorce simply based on whether or not there is contempt in the language that's used when spoken to their spouse. It's very fascinating. Yeah, and so then, even from here, from words like this, you get terms like Mooney, or, the word Mormon is often used in a derogatory context as well. It's a way of creating labels. And I think the media really needs to think about, or at least consider, the implications of the words that they create. At the most basic level, you can treat somebody with respect by calling an organization their actual official name, like, let's start there from the most basic level of respect. I think it's really telling also about right now, there is a lot of negative media surrounding, the Unification Church, as we're commonly referred to, in Japan. And particularly because of what happened with former Prime Minister Abe's assassination, that he was targeted because he was supposedly connected to our church. And because of that, he lost his life. And yet the media is taking this as an opportunity to really create a lot of negative bias. There aren't I don't see a lot of articles or journalists consulting with religion scholars, with people who study, organizations and can speak in a more unbiased manner. And so when you look at what's happening now because of that, and this is a modern day democracy, I think that's pretty alarming, that suddenly you have legislation being pushed through that's being punitive, aimed specifically at us, and yet not considering the greater implications on other religious bodies as well. So, for example, just in December, they passed legislation to say that it is now considered child abuse to say that your child, for a parent to tell their child that they might go to hell, is now considered child abuse, broadly speaking. And that kind of legislation it was aimed at our organization, but the Financial Times did a great article actually unpacking this a little bit. Have they thought through the implications? The fact that this type of legislation could also be used against practicing Buddhists or practicing Shintoists. Rushing through this kind of thing is exactly what Brené unpacks in her research on not her research, but in referencing the research on dehumanization and where this could possibly lead to. Just another example is, so a few years back when my oldest was in first grade, I believe it was, it was right around the time of the elections, and right before Trump was elected president, and we live in a very, very blue area. And she came home saying that the kids, as a kindergartner, she came home saying, "Oh yeah, the kids in my class were talking about that we should kill Trump." And I was horrified. I mean, absolutely horrified that kids, the 6-year-old kids, are talking about using that kind of language because of what they were hearing from their parents. And despite the fact that I myself am a Democrat, I hope that doesn't change your view of me too much. And I don't align with Trump necessarily, but I had to sit her down and have a real talk about, it is first of all, talking about killing people is not okay. But second of all, it's really unfair to the people who do believe in the things that he talks about. And you have to learn to take a perspective that's going to understand why other people believe something that you might not believe. And we have to learn to engage with those people and talk about those things and think about those things rather than just condemning somebody because they believe something different from us. Yes. So I'd like to propose this model that I learned about on Krista Tippett's On Being podcast, which if you love spirituality of any kind, I highly recommend it. I get so much life out of listening to her interviews. But she interviewed Trabian Shorters, who he is a global authority on asset framing, which uses cognitive science to multiply the reach, appeal, and outcomes of social impact and equity initiatives. His area is particularly focused at ethnic minority representation, but I think it has broader implications for religious representation as well. So asset framing is a process of defining communities by their aspirations and contributions rather than their challenges and deficits. And this quote from him, the fact of the matter is we all want the same things, and deficit narratives and stigmatization are what's preventing us from seeing each other as assets. I have some great quotes from him, but I'll save that for another time. I would say that, this approach of asset framing, actually, it really is an example of conflict resolution at its on a larger scale. But even on a personal level, you're not going to win an argument with somebody by condemning them, are you? You have to acknowledge some of the positives that the other person coming to the table brings. You have to try to connect on your shared points of things that you have in common in order to open the dialogue and to resolve conflict. And he talks about this also from the perspective of, the way that we talk about and represent. For him, it's representation of the Black community, but really it could be applied more widely. I'd even say that this is it's a great example of, interfaith interactions. I think joining the Religion Communicators Council has also given me so much life because talking to other people about their faith and learning and understanding from that, it really enhances an appreciation of my own faith as well. It deepens my faith. I think it helps me to be a better practitioner of unificationism by understanding other people's faiths as well. I think Professor Campbell touched on it by talking about holy envy. I love that expression, like really admiring the beautiful qualities of somebody else's faith makes me feel more deeply connected and that I'm practicing my own faith more deeply as well by respecting that. So some of the organizations, so Mr. Shorters also works with Solution Journalism Network, which looks at reframing news articles rather than from only approaching things from a deficit perspective. A lot of newsroom editors will kind of use the most salacious headlines in order to kind of capture eyeballs, right? But even Psychology Today magazine reported recently that people are suffering from something close to trauma from overexposure to negative news. And so journalists really, I think it's our responsibility in the media to really take a look at what is the impact of how we're writing on society at large. And the Solutions Journalism Network is trying to teach journalists a new way of framing narratives by first tackling what are the contributions of these minority groups and framing it as an asset, and then going into the areas where they're underserved or the negative points that still need to be addressed. And of course, there's also organizations. I mean, I think Professor Campbell's presentation is more comprehensive in the organizations that we can work with. But, I really recommend to people who don't necessarily work with the media or aren't directly engaged in them, please support these organizations that do work with journalists and media, make a small donation or, contact them, ask them how you can support, maybe volunteer your time if you can, because they're doing great work, like the Religion News Association, Religion Communicators Council. They are really actively trying to engage the media in a way to bring the positives of religion and religious representation to the public. And I just want to close on this short clip from that specific interview with Krista Tippett and Travian Shorters. I think it's rather than kind of rereading the words, I'd love for you guys to hear the conversation because it was just so inspiring to me. So I'll just play this little clip for you. Oh, sorry. Actually, let me share my sound. There we go.
I'm Krista Tippett, and this is On Being. Today, I'm with Travian Shorters, a visionary social entrepreneur and the creator of Asset Framing. I know you're doing some work with the Solutions Journalism Project and perhaps
Yes.
with other journalists. And journalists are often also very, very mission-driven people.
No doubt.
But the forms that have us investigate dysfunction
Yes.
and focus just with such intensity on what is catastrophic and corrupt and failing seem at this stage, you can look at history and you can see where that led to things being made better. But right now, as you said, there's all this reasonable despair and
Yes.
fear, and that is deepening it. And something that I can't remember if you wrote this somewhere or said it, but as I was investigating you, you said we crave the moral, and you're just really talking about at that nervous system brain level, we crave the moral direction stories provide. And I think that is such an interesting way to underscore what is at stake and kind of a calling to the parts of our society that help us piece our story together.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I use Black racial experience as kind of a divining rod for these conversations, in part because that's where America, we stumble all, whatever we say we believe, you throw Black racial considerations and all of a sudden we go sideways, right? Yeah. And so to your point about the role that media plays, I've said this to David Bornstein, who is the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network, that if there is a sort of narrative of racial hatred in the United States, then the news media is co-author of that narrative and co-conspirator in the cover-up. It's very easy to understand from a sociological standpoint that when the media reports on populations in cities and neighborhoods a very specific and particular way and never counterbalances that narrative with any positives, then the only patterns that our brain have to draw upon are fear triggers.
I think this was from something that Solutions Journalism had. Anyway, it's like this is the original lead of a story, right? For example.
Yes.
And it's just so familiar. Right? The Latinx community in the United States has always been, for the most part, on the bottom half on income in the American society. The struggle to have access to health and mental care is part of the history. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has come to intensify the problems. And that's how it starts. It goes on. Yep. And that's a very familiar way into story. And then here's a revised lead that I think your team took a look at. And it starts this way. So since 2014, Latinx people have constituted the largest ethnic group in the nation's largest state. They now represent 39% of the California population. And then it goes on to talk about in recent years, Latinx residents have made advances in economic well-being, measured by metrics like reduced poverty rates, growth in business ownership. And then after a couple of sentences like that, people elected school boards, local offices.
Yeah, they've made progress in everything except for this.
And then, despite this impressive social and economic progress, Latinx residents have lagged behind other Californians in achieving important goals like home ownership and income growth. And we can now add to that list the disproportionate harm visited on the community by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, with that example, that was the California Health Care Foundation, I believe.
Oh, yeah, right. But you've worked with them.
We trained and consulted, and then they
learned to do this. Yeah.
They applied it. Yeah. And what I want to underscore in those two different ways of framing, all the facts were accurate. Nobody made anything up.
Yeah.
Both framings are true, right? So we didn't have to invent anything. The first framing, however, about how Latin American folk has always failed in these ways, that framing totally left out all the assets, all the aspirations, all the content. It characterized them literally without value. The asset frame version started with their value, yet still told you about all the ways that they're not, where they want to be. Right?
Yeah.
So that's why we suggest to journalists, it is more accurate and honest reporting. When you're going to tell the story where all you do is point out what's broken, but you don't point out what's working in a culture, well, recognize you're inclining people to think that all that exists about that culture is brokenness.
Yeah.
They didn't come up with that conclusion on their own. They came up with that conclusion by your reporting. And so that's what I mean by journalism ends up being a co-author.
Yes. So, amazing podcast interview. I think asset framing maybe is an approach that we could explore in the media as a new way to engage society in conversations about representation. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Nancy. That was quite inspiring. If you look at the different messages in the text, you'll see that even Professor Campbell says, wow, I'm really enjoying this. But we have a couple of interesting questions here. Maybe we can just go right to those. We only have a few more minutes, unfortunately, but we're going to try something after the official ending of this webinar. If any of the panelists have time to stay on, please do. And any of our live audience, if you just stay where you are, we can continue the conversation and answer some of the questions we might not get to in our time allotted, okay? But here's a question from, where'd it go? This is from Professor Thomas Sellover. It's directed to Professor Campbell. He says that you mentioned the concept of religious illiteracy on the part of the media. How about the general populace? How about the general populace's religious illiteracy? How can the media, let me have to pull this down a little bit. How can the media help to alleviate that general illiteracy, religious illiteracy? Professor Campbell?
I think there is a critical role for, you might be familiar with Stephen Prothero at Boston University, who's written a book about this topic, about and he often quizzes his class, and most people can't get Bible stories correct, or even the basics of Christianity, Buddhism, or Islam correct. So one thing I think the media could do, and I would say the BBC is doing really well at this. In their website, there's like so many ways you can actually investigate and look learn about different faiths from a UK perspective. And in fact, in that all-party parliamentary group document they produced, that they said that there should be a role of the media in the UK to educate the citizens of the UK about different faiths and how they integrate. We don't have that kind of government push, but perhaps we could start talking more about how media, and unfortunately we used to have a really great PBS news program that's now off the air, So how do we reintroduce some of these good reporting? And, Bobby and his group and Religion Unplugged and Get Religion are good. And the Religion News Service has some great things that are going on, but there still is probably underreported, and we need to probably figure out some other ways to address that.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, again, it points back to the family, the parents sharing their wisdom about this religious issue is the starting point, I think. But then as as the larger public is addressed, then of course the media gets involved there.
And I want to say that, can I just add one thing, and that
Sure.
is interfaith. I'm a big fan of interfaith, and I'm a member of the Salt Lake Interfaith Roundtable. And I think there is some really good things going on here, even though we have a dominant faith in Salt Lake. It's been great to, do religious outreach and visits to different faith communities and spaces. So perhaps even activating the interfaith, and then we get the media to cover it. So that's been helpful.
Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so in wrapping up, I would just like to ask each one of you to give a 1 minute final statement on the program, and then we'll go ahead with the next phase of ongoing conversation outside of the official webinar. So perhaps Nancy, would you like to start, and then Bobby, and then Dr. Campbell?
Okay.
Sure. Yeah, I think that even though this webinar was really focused on the media and media representation, I think that the language that we use really matters, even on a day-to-day, as a human being. And language, our words carry the ability to connect us as human beings and as a society, and they also have the power to disconnect us. And so, yeah, I hope that looking at that framework, asset framing, and also just really understanding the power of the words that we carry and the implications that they have for others, I hope that, that will help the media to do a better job. I think they want to do a better job, and I think that we want to support them in that way, rather than kind of, condemning them or coming at it from a perspective of judgment. So, yeah.
Thank you. Bobby,
Well,
from the streets.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. This has been really enjoyed the discussion and being a part of it. I guess, the part about the discussion about cults and kind of how words mean things, that's important. I was even sitting here thinking, kind of as we talk about the media, that in some ways, even the phrase the media carries negative connotations today. I tend to say news media when I'm referring to journalists, and I think even, the term journalist may be more neutral in this era, especially since we had a president call the quote media the enemy of the people, that distinguishing between journalists and when you say the media, are you talking about TV talking heads? Are you talking about Sean Hannity blabbing on TV at night? Are you talking about actual journalists? So I think some precision in that language maybe is helpful, but this is just a great discussion to be a part of. And so I really appreciate the invitation.
Okay, thank you, Bobby, for being here. We really appreciate
Thanks.
it. Professor Campbell?
I've spoken a lot, but Nancy reminded me, in my another life, I was a young Latter-day Saint missionary on the streets of Seoul, Korea, and met many friends in the unification movement there. And I think we shared both the same terminology. Cult in Korean is idan. And I felt the sting of that many times as I was walking down the street or trying to share my version of Christ's gospel, and people would yell at me, idan, idan, and it really hurt. I mean, and I'm sure that my friends in the unification movement have heard that same term. And for some reason in Korean, it really hurts me. So, but I just want to say we need to move to a place where we can have this respect. And there's a friend of mine has developed something called the Integrity Index, and they started rating political campaigns on the quality of dialogue. And I really think we can apply this to journalism too. But getting to Nancy's point is, how can we move beyond misunderstanding and polarization, but start to, in an interfaith way, or journalists to religious person of faith, how can we start to move beyond the labels, these information, and really try to get to honesty? And it's unfortunate, I have, my heart and soul has been in Asia. I've done a lot of Asian studies and worked, have been in Korea and in Japan. And maybe we should hold a conference about improving journalism in Asia. I don't know. Anyway, but that may be a discussion we have later. So it's been a wonderful discussion. I've learned so much, and thanks so much.
Yes, thank you so much. I think Dr. Jenkins would like to just say a little something for us.
Thank you. Thank you, Hans. I'm very pleased and grateful for this discussion. Mr. Bobby Ross Jr., what a wonderful presentation, that you are also looking deeply and also with such an open mind. Coming from a particular denomination, you expanded to the whole world of religion. Professor Campbell, also, I'm really grateful for your insights about covering religion, and also the whole importance of the fact that religion is central to our understanding of our values and what we've learned through the religious freedom efforts. It is absolutely the base. Religious freedom is the base of all freedoms. If you take away religious freedom, you can't have free speech. You can't have the others. So, Nancy, it's so good to see what you've done with the unification movement in terms of answering the phone, getting back to the New York Times within 20 minutes or 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and then having one of the best articles we've ever had on the whole marriage, principle and program. It's very, very encouraging. At the Washington Times, our president, Chris Dolan, really is concerned because we're in an era where there's so much information so rapidly available that many are pushed to just keep pushing out information to stay on the cutting edge. And that's why you'll find things that are not fact-checked, or even fundamental mistakes in just grammar and journalism right in the Washington Post or the other important newspapers. And the Times, I'm saying, they're really, really serious about getting both sides. And that's why now we all of a sudden are seeing more people turn to the Times, especially from the Christian communities, because there is a double check on everything. And the stories are really, focused on getting both sides. I love this. Don't interview the negative people to understand, another faith. Don't try to. You won't get any perspective that's helpful. So, well, thank you very much, Hans. This is really tremendous program, and compliments to Ray and Pierre, who are our IMAP team for North America. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jenkins. Yes, and thank you again for all of your wonderful presentations. IMAP is really seeking to support or initiate the expansionary view, towards healing our world and our nation, rather than taking a more reactive approach. So thank you so much for enforcing that view. And if you have time, please stay on and continue with some of the questions we had. 50 or 60 people online. I'm not sure if there's